On July 31, 2025, Susan Monarez was sworn in as the 21st Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, making history as the first to be confirmed by the Senate under a new 2023 law. At 50 years old, Monarez brought a unique approach to the agency. She was the first CDC director in 50 years who didn't hold a medical degree. Her career was built on infectious disease research and artificial intelligence for health improvement. Before her appointment, she served as deputy director at the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, a research funding agency focused on biomedical innovations. This background in cutting-edge technology and data analysis set her apart from traditional medical administrators. The road to the top wasn't easy. Initially, President Trump had chosen former Republican Congressman Dave Weldon for the position, but withdrew him after intense criticism over his views linking vaccines to autism. Monarez emerged as a more moderate choice, with a scientific background that could bridge differences between political factions. During her Senate confirmation hearing in June, Monarez presented a vision for a CDC that would be grounded in science and protect Americans' health. Democratic senators expressed concerns about her independence from political pressures, while Republicans emphasized the need for reforms at the agency. Her confirmation passed along party lines, with Republicans supporting her and Democrats expressing reservations. However, from day one of her tenure, Monarez faced unprecedented challenges. The agency was dealing with massive layoffs, with approximately 600 employees losing their jobs, including those working on responses to infectious diseases like bird flu. These cuts affected critical departments responsible for environmental hazard research and public record requests. The most shocking challenge came on August 8, when a gunman opened fire at the CDC's headquarters in Atlanta. The perpetrator, who believed he had been harmed by COVID-19 vaccines, fired hundreds of bullets at the building, killing a police officer. Monarez took responsibility for reassuring staff and addressing the crisis. In an internal meeting after the attack, Monarez emphasized the dangers of misinformation. "We know that misinformation can be dangerous, not only to health, but to those that trust us and those we want to trust. We need to rebuild the trust together." This stance would prove prophetic, as she would soon find herself at the center of a political storm that would shake the foundations of the CDC. The attack highlighted the real-world consequences of anti-vaccine rhetoric and conspiracy theories. Current and former CDC employees wrote an open letter accusing Kennedy of fueling violence toward healthcare workers with his anti-vaccine statements. The letter pointed to the shooting as evidence of how dangerous misinformation could become when it reached unstable individuals. Despite these challenges, Monarez appeared determined to maintain the CDC's scientific integrity. She worked to comfort agency employees and implement security enhancements following the shooting. Her leadership during this crisis earned her respect among CDC staff, who saw her as a strong advocate for their safety and the agency's mission. However, behind the scenes, tensions were building with the Trump administration's health leadership. Sources within the government reported growing friction between Monarez and Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. over vaccine policies and the direction of public health initiatives. The scientific community watched nervously as Kennedy implemented sweeping changes to vaccine policies, limiting access to COVID-19 vaccines and reshaping advisory panels to include vaccine opponents. These moves directly contradicted decades of established public health practice and put Monarez in an impossible position. As the first CDC director to undergo Senate confirmation, Monarez understood the weight of her position. She had been chosen not just by the president, but approved by the legislative branch, giving her a unique mandate to serve the American people. This constitutional backing would soon become crucial as political pressures mounted. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of executive power and the independence of America's premier public health agency. Monarez's commitment to scientific integrity was about to collide head-on with the political agenda of one of the most controversial figures in American health policy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Trump's controversial health secretary, brought to the administration a decades-long history of vaccine opposition. As an anti-vaccine activist, Kennedy had spread conspiracy theories linking vaccines to autism, despite overwhelming scientific evidence debunking these claims. His appointment to lead America's health agencies sent shockwaves through the medical community. When Kennedy assumed his position, he immediately launched a campaign to restructure American vaccination policies. Within weeks, he cut $500 million from contracts focused on developing mRNA vaccines, drawing sharp criticism from the scientific community and former government officials. This move signaled his intention to fundamentally alter how America approached vaccine development and distribution. The first major clash between Kennedy and Monarez came when the health secretary demanded that the CDC director support sweeping changes to vaccination policies. According to sources within the government, Kennedy wanted Monarez to endorse restrictions on vaccine access and to fire career scientists who opposed his agenda. This put Monarez in an impossible position: comply with unscientific directives or stand firm on established public health principles. The tension escalated when Kennedy began reshaping vaccine advisory panels to include opponents of vaccination. These panels, traditionally composed of independent medical experts, were being stacked with individuals who shared Kennedy's skeptical views on vaccine safety and efficacy. For Monarez, this represented a dangerous politicization of scientific decision-making. On Wednesday, August 27th, the conflict reached a boiling point. The Food and Drug Administration, under Kennedy's influence, made a stunning announcement that would reshape America's COVID-19 vaccine policy. The emergency use authorizations for COVID-19 vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna, and Novavax were revoked for most Americans. These vaccines, which CDC experts estimated had saved 3.2 million lives in the United States, would now only be available to people 65 and older or those with underlying medical conditions. Kennedy celebrated this decision on social media, writing, "The emergency use authorizations for COVID vaccines, once used to justify broad mandates on the general public during the Biden administration, are now rescinded." This statement revealed the political motivation behind the policy change. It wasn't based on new scientific evidence, but on ideological opposition to the previous administration's approach. For Monarez, this was the final straw. As CDC director, she had sworn to protect public health based on scientific evidence, not political considerations. The restriction of life-saving vaccines to only high-risk populations flew in the face of everything she believed about preventive medicine and public health policy. Sources close to the situation revealed that Kennedy had demanded Monarez publicly endorse these changes and fire CDC scientists who had worked on vaccine recommendations. When she refused, Kennedy reportedly became increasingly hostile, viewing her resistance as insubordination rather than scientific integrity. The philosophical divide between Kennedy and Monarez couldn't have been starker. Kennedy saw the CDC as an agency that needed to be fixed and brought in line with Trump's political agenda. In a Fox News interview, he stated that the CDC is in trouble, and we need to fix it, claiming the agency had taken the wrong approach during the COVID pandemic regarding social distancing, masking, and school closures. Monarez, on the other hand, viewed the CDC as a scientific institution that should base its recommendations on evidence, not politics. Her background in infectious disease research and data analysis had taught her the importance of following scientific protocols, even when they conflicted with political preferences. The conflict intensified when Kennedy began pressuring Monarez to implement what her lawyers would later describe as unscientific, reckless directives. These included not only the vaccine restrictions but also demands to dismiss experienced public health professionals who had served through multiple administrations. As the standoff continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a disagreement between two officials, it was a fundamental battle over the soul of American public health. Would science or politics determine how the nation protected its citizens from disease? The answer would soon shake the CDC to its core and leave America's public health infrastructure in unprecedented chaos. The moment of truth arrived on Wednesday evening, August 27th, when Susan Monarez made a decision that would define her legacy and plunge America's top health agency into chaos. Faced with mounting pressure from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to implement what she viewed as dangerous and unscientific policies, Monarez drew a line in the sand that she would not cross. According to her legal team, Kennedy had presented Monarez with a series of demands that went far beyond normal policy disagreements. He wanted her to publicly endorse the restriction of COVID-19 vaccines, fire experienced CDC scientists who disagreed with his approach, and essentially transform the agency from a science-based institution into a political tool serving the Trump administration's agenda. The breaking point came during a tense meeting where Kennedy reportedly gave Monarez an ultimatum: comply with his directives or face removal from office. Sources familiar with the conversation described it as heated, with Kennedy expressing frustration at what he saw as Monarez's obstruction of the president's health agenda. Monarez's response was swift and unequivocal. She refused to rubber-stamp unscientific, reckless directives, as her lawyers would later describe it. This wasn't just professional disagreement, it was a moral stand based on her oath to protect public health. She had not spent decades building expertise in infectious disease research only to abandon scientific principles for political expediency. The CDC director's refusal sent shockwaves through the Department of Health and Human Services. Kennedy, accustomed to getting his way in the new administration, was reportedly furious at what he perceived as insubordination. He immediately began working to have Monarez removed from her position, setting in motion a constitutional crisis that would expose the limits of executive power. What made Monarez's stand particularly significant was her unique position as the first Senate-confirmed CDC director. Unlike previous directors who served at the pleasure of the president, Monarez had undergone the constitutional process of Senate confirmation, giving her a different legal standing. Her lawyers would later argue that this confirmation process provided her with protections that couldn't be easily dismissed. The support Monarez received from within the CDC was immediate and overwhelming. Career scientists who had worked through multiple administrations rallied behind their director, viewing her stand as a defense of the agency's scientific integrity. Many had already been demoralized by the mass layoffs and political interference, but Monarez's courage gave them hope that someone was willing to fight for their mission. Dr. Demetre Daskalakis, who would later resign in protest, privately told colleagues that Monarez's refusal to bow to political pressure represented the best traditions of public service. Other senior officials echoed these sentiments, seeing her stand as a defense not just of the CDC, but of the principle that science should guide public health policy. The decision to resist Kennedy's demands wasn't made lightly. Monarez understood the potential consequences. Her career, her reputation, and her ability to serve the American people were all at stake. But she also understood that compromising on fundamental scientific principles would undermine the CDC's credibility and potentially cost lives. Her legal team, led by prominent attorneys Mark Zaid and Abbe David Lowell, began preparing for what they knew would be a complex legal battle. They researched precedents for removing Senate-confirmed officials and prepared arguments about the constitutional separation of powers. Their strategy would center on the argument that only President Trump himself, not subordinate officials like Kennedy, had the authority to remove a Senate-confirmed director. As word of the standoff leaked to the media, public health experts across the country watched in amazement and concern. Many had never seen such a direct confrontation between political appointees and career public health officials. The implications extended far beyond the CDC. This was a test of whether scientific expertise could maintain independence in an increasingly politicized environment. The stage was now set for an unprecedented showdown that would determine not just Monarez's fate, but the future direction of American public health policy. Her categorical refusal to compromise on scientific principles had drawn a battle line that would soon engulf the entire CDC in chaos. As the standoff between Susan Monarez and the Trump administration intensified, a complex legal question emerged that would determine not just her fate, but the balance of power between the executive branch and Senate-confirmed officials. The constitutional implications of this battle reached far beyond the CDC, touching on fundamental questions about presidential authority and the independence of federal agencies. Monarez's legal team, led by renowned attorneys Mark Zaid and Abbe David Lowell, immediately began crafting a defense based on a crucial legal distinction. Unlike previous CDC directors who served at the pleasure of the president, Monarez had been confirmed by the Senate under the 2023 law that changed the appointment process. This confirmation, they argued, provided her with constitutional protections that couldn't be easily dismissed by subordinate officials. The lawyer's central argument was both simple and profound. Only President Trump himself possessed the constitutional authority to remove a Senate-confirmed CDC director. When Health and Human Services officials announced her termination, Zaid and Lowell contended that this action was legally insufficient. Receiving an email from an HR staffer simply saying, "You're fired," is insufficient as a matter of law to constitute the termination of a federal employee, especially one appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, Zaid declared. This legal position drew on established precedent regarding the removal of Senate-confirmed officials. Throughout American history, the Supreme Court has recognized that certain federal positions require direct presidential action for removal, particularly when Congress has established specific confirmation procedures. The 2023 law requiring Senate confirmation for CDC directors was designed to insulate the position from political interference, making removal more difficult than for typical political appointees. Constitutional scholars quickly weighed in on the unprecedented situation. Professor Jonathan Turley of George Washington University noted that the case presented fascinating questions about the scope of presidential removal power and the role of Senate confirmation in protecting federal officials. The situation was complicated by the fact that Kennedy, as health secretary, was technically Monarez's superior in the chain of command, yet lacked the constitutional authority to remove a Senate-confirmed official. The legal complexity deepened when examining historical precedents. The Supreme Court's decision in Myers v. United States, 1926, established broad presidential removal power, but subsequent cases like Humphrey's Executor v. United States, 1935, and Morrison v. Olson, 1988, created exceptions for officials serving in quasi-independent roles. The question became whether the CDC director, despite being part of the executive branch, possessed sufficient independence to warrant protection from arbitrary removal. Zaid and Lowell also raised procedural arguments about due process. They contended that even if the president possessed removal authority, proper procedures hadn't been followed. No formal notification had been received from the White House, no reasons had been provided, and no opportunity for response had been given. These procedural defects, they argued, rendered any attempted removal legally invalid. The White House, caught off guard by the legal challenge, scrambled to respond. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt attempted to clarify the administration's position, stating that the president fired her, which he has every right to do. However, this statement came hours after the initial HHS announcement, raising questions about whether proper procedures had been followed from the beginning. Legal experts noted the unusual nature of the public dispute. Typically, removal of high-level officials occurs through private communications and formal documentation. The fact that this battle was playing out in public statements and social media posts suggested a breakdown in normal governmental processes. The implications extended beyond Monarez's individual case. If subordinate officials could remove Senate-confirmed directors without direct presidential action, it would effectively nullify the Senate's constitutional role in the confirmation process. This could set a dangerous precedent for other independent agencies and officials who rely on Senate confirmation for protection from political interference. As the legal battle intensified, both sides prepared for what could become a landmark case defining the limits of executive power. The question wasn't just whether Susan Monarez would keep her job, but whether the constitutional system of checks and balances could withstand the pressures of an increasingly polarized political environment. The unprecedented standoff at the CDC sent shockwaves through Washington's political establishment, creating fault lines that extended far beyond typical partisan divisions. As news of Susan Monarez's refusal to resign spread, politicians from both parties scrambled to respond to a crisis that threatened to undermine public confidence in America's health infrastructure. Democratic leaders immediately rallied to Monarez's defense, framing her stand as a heroic defense of scientific integrity against political interference. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called an emergency press conference, declaring that Dr. Monarez represents the best of American public service, a dedicated scientist willing to put public health above political pressure. He announced that Senate Democrats would launch an investigation into what he termed the systematic destruction of our public health agencies. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries went further, calling for Kennedy's resignation and accusing the Trump administration of weaponizing public health for political gain. In a strongly worded statement, Jeffries declared that the American people deserve health officials who follow science, not political ideology. Dr. Monarez's courage in standing up to unscientific directives should be celebrated, not punished. The reaction from progressive Democrats was even more intense. Senator Elizabeth Warren took to social media, writing, "RFK Jr. is systematically dismantling our public health infrastructure. Dr. Monarez's refusal to rubber-stamp dangerous policies is exactly what we need from our health officials. We stand with science." Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez organized a letter signed by over 100 House Democrats demanding Monarez's reinstatement. Republican responses revealed significant divisions within the party. Traditional conservatives who valued institutional stability found themselves uncomfortable with the chaos at the CDC, while Trump loyalists defended the administration's right to implement its agenda. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, known for her moderate positions, expressed concern about the unprecedented nature of this conflict and its implications for public health preparedness. However, most Republican leaders closed ranks behind the administration. House Speaker Mike Johnson defended Kennedy's actions, stating that the American people elected President Trump to drain the swamp and reform our federal agencies. If Dr. Monarez cannot support the president's agenda, then she should step aside. Senator Ted Cruz went further, accusing Monarez of deep state resistance to the democratically elected administration. The most surprising reactions came from within the medical and scientific communities, where the response transcended traditional political boundaries. The American Medical Association, typically cautious about political statements, issued an unprecedented statement supporting Monarez's position. The independence of public health officials from political interference is essential for protecting American lives, the AMA declared. Dr. Monarez's commitment to scientific integrity deserves our full support. Former CDC directors from both Republican and Democratic administrations united in an extraordinary show of bipartisan support. Dr. Robert Redfield, who served under Trump's first term, broke with his former boss to defend Monarez. The CDC director must be free to follow the science, regardless of political pressures, Redfield stated. Dr. Monarez is upholding the highest traditions of public service. The crisis also exposed deep divisions within the Trump administration itself. Sources within the White House revealed that several officials were uncomfortable with Kennedy's aggressive approach to reshaping health agencies. Some worried that the public battle with Monarez was creating unnecessary controversy and undermining the administration's broader agenda. Public opinion polls showed Americans deeply divided along partisan lines, but with concerning implications for public health. A CNN poll found that 67% of Democrats trusted Monarez more than Kennedy on health issues, while 71% of Republicans sided with the administration. More troubling was the finding that overall trust in the CDC had plummeted to historic lows, with only 42% of Americans expressing confidence in the agency. International reactions added another layer of complexity. The World Health Organization expressed concern about the stability of America's public health leadership, while European health officials privately worried about the implications for global disease surveillance and response. The chaos at the CDC was being viewed worldwide as a sign of American institutional weakness. As the political battle intensified, it became clear that this was about more than one official's job. It was a defining moment for the role of science in American governance and the independence of public health from political interference. As the dust settles on this unprecedented crisis, America finds itself at a crossroads that will determine the future of public health policy for generations to come. The battle between Susan Monarez and the Trump administration has exposed fundamental fractures in how the nation approaches the intersection of science, politics, and public safety. The immediate aftermath of the standoff has left the CDC in unprecedented chaos. With Monarez's status unclear and at least 4 top officials having resigned in protest, the agency responsible for protecting 330 million Americans from disease threats is operating without clear leadership. Dr. Demetra Daskalakis, Dr. Deborah Oury, Dr. Daniel Jernigan, and Dr. Jennifer Layden, all seasoned professionals with decades of experience, have walked away from their posts, taking with them irreplaceable institutional knowledge. The mass exodus has created dangerous gaps in America's disease surveillance and response capabilities. At a time when bird flu threatens to become the next pandemic, when measles cases have reached 30-year highs, and when climate change is expanding the range of vector-borne diseases, the nation's premier public health agency is hemorrhaging expertise. Career CDC employees describe a workplace in turmoil, with remaining staff uncertain about their future and demoralized by the political interference in their scientific work. The legal battle over Monarez's removal continues to unfold, with constitutional scholars predicting it could reach the Supreme Court. The case has implications far beyond the CDC, potentially reshaping the balance of power between the executive branch and Senate-confirmed officials across the federal government. If the administration's removal of Monarez is upheld without direct presidential action, it could set a precedent that undermines the Senate's constitutional role in confirming federal officials. Meanwhile, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. shows no signs of backing down from his aggressive restructuring of American health policy. Sources within HHS suggest he is preparing even more sweeping changes to vaccine recommendations, potentially restricting access to childhood immunizations that have prevented millions of deaths over decades. The scientific community watches in horror as evidence-based policies are replaced with ideology-driven directives. The international implications of this crisis cannot be overstated. America's leadership in global health has been built on the CDC's scientific credibility and expertise. Foreign health officials who once looked to Atlanta for guidance now express private concerns about the reliability of American health recommendations. This erosion of trust could have lasting consequences for international cooperation on disease outbreaks and pandemic preparedness. Public health experts warn of several potential scenarios, none of them encouraging. If Kennedy succeeds in fully implementing his agenda, America could see a return of vaccine-preventable diseases that were once nearly eliminated. Measles, whooping cough, and other childhood diseases could resurge, particularly in communities where vaccine hesitancy is already high. The economic costs alone could reach billions of dollars, not counting the human suffering. Alternatively, if the legal and political pressure forces a reversal of Kennedy's policies, the damage to institutional trust may already be irreversible. The CDC's credibility, built over nearly 8 decades, has been severely undermined by this public battle. Restoring public confidence in the agency's recommendations could take years, during which time Americans may remain vulnerable to preventable diseases. The crisis has also highlighted the fragility of America's public health infrastructure. The ease with which political appointees could disrupt decades of scientific progress reveals systemic weaknesses that extend beyond any single administration. Future reforms may need to provide stronger protections for public health agencies and their scientific independence. Perhaps most troubling is the precedent this crisis sets for future administrations. If political ideology can override scientific expertise in matters of life and death, what other evidence-based policies might be vulnerable to political interference? Climate science, environmental protection, and food safety could all face similar challenges if the principle of scientific independence is not restored. As America grapples with these questions, one thing remains certain: the outcome of this battle will reverberate through the halls of government and the laboratories of science for years to come. The choice between politics and science has never been starker, and the consequences have never been higher.